suggests. I'm looking at a particular battle, a significant one, the largest battle of the American Revolution, or the War of Independence, in 1775 to 1781. The largest, the first significant campaign of this war. But I'm looking at it from a particular perspective, and that's one of the British Army and the British generalship. I will obviously mention the American forces and General George Washington and his commanders at the time, but it's got a bit of a slant to it, and that is coming from a British perspective. Because the theme I've taken is one where, being the largest battle and a fairly significant one, the question I had as I was researching this particular campaign or this particular battle was, why were the British not successful? Now you might ask the question, well, didn't they win? Yes, they were victorious on the battlefield, but were they successful strategically? So we are looking at this battle both from a tactical point of view and also from a strategic one. So that's where that particular title comes from, the fumbling of a victory. That'll give you a rough idea of how this presentation will evolve over the course of the 50 minutes that we had this morning. As you can see, we'll start very broadly and then start to narrow down into the battle itself. Hopefully you'll get the idea of how that theme will emerge throughout the presentation. But have in mind that we are looking at it from a British perspective. So it was very hard for me to know where to start because everything tends to interrelate. There's a lot of layers. We've got to remember that this particular war is both a political and a military, has both political and military objectives. So what I've tried to do is probably spend less on the political and more on the military, but in saying that, there'll be times when I'll have to mention something of the political nature of this particular war. So I've chosen to start with the end of the Boston siege. The siege itself went for 9 months. It really began at the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, which was the smaller hill in front of Bunker Hill, and that was on June 17, 1775. So the siege itself started at the end of that. We know that the British were victorious, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The British lost 40% casualty rate, which you've got to remember was quite significant at that time. It was only a small force stationed in Boston. Losing or having a casualty rate of 40% was quite significant. They only had about 2,200 men, and they had a casualty rate of 1,000. So you can imagine that the British themselves were quite shaken by that particular battle. They advanced 3 times. It was only on the last occasion that they were able to push the Americans off their defences. So that's where it begins. Now, George Washington only became Commander-in-Chief just before that. So he only was appointed Commander-in-Chief after Lexington and Concord when they came back. After Bunker Hill. So he wasn't a Commander-in-Chief at the time of Bunker Hill. It was Artemus Ward, General Artemus Ward, who was in charge of American forces. So he was appointed later. So at that time, he took over while the siege occurred. And we know with the siege, it only ended after General Henry Knox was able to transport 48 guns on Fort Ticonderoga which is located on Lake Champlain, all the way down to Boston, positioned them on Dorchester Heights. The British realised that their position was untenable, and at that time Gage was replaced by Howe. Howe withdrew out of Boston. Now at that point, Howe decided to go to Halifax. He needed to regroup, he needed to gather provisions, but more importantly, he needed to train this new army that he was developing. While he transported over to Halifax, word was out that the Parliament had approved for an army to be transported from London to Halifax to support him in the next campaign. Who was the main driver? When we're talking about the British Parliament, who was the main driver? In this case, it was Lord George Germain. Lord George Germain was only appointed Secretary of State for American Affairs in 1775. Now, during this time, Lord North was the Prime Minister, or he preferred to be called the first Prime Minister. Didn't have the heart in this particular war. He was a great orator. He managed the Parliament really well. He was quite respected by the parliamentarians and the Commons, the House of Commons. But he did not have the stomach to fight this war. King George III needed somebody to drive this adventure, this campaign to bring the American rebels back to the empire. So he relied on Lord George Germain. Now, Lord George Germain has an interesting background. He had a dark cloud over his head after the Battle of Minden in 1759 during the 7 Years' War. He was disgraced. He wasn't court-martialed, but he called for a court-martial because he wanted to clear his name. He did, but he didn't. So this cloud remained over him for a number of years. This position that he found himself in 1775 was a way of regaining that confidence. It's redemption. It's time to show all his peers within the House of Lords and House of Commons that he was the soldier that he came to be. So he was quite driven by the fact that he needed to win this war against the American rebels. He had a simple plan, a very good plan. He wanted to divide the colonies. So you've got to remember too that the Parliament believed that most Americans didn't want this war. The regular Joe Blow farmer out there did not want this war. The war was being fueled by a small group of greedy American merchants, e.g. John Hancock from Boston. This is what they believed. In some respects, it was quite true initially, until after the Declaration of Independence was announced. So this is what they believed. So they thought, if we can send a significant force to America, show force, the American people would realise that they needed to regain their part within the empire, their relationship with the king. So Lord George Germain had a simple plan. Now, this particular map is actually showing the Saratoga campaign in 1777, so I do apologise for that. But it's the best one I could find to show what Lord George Germain's plan was. And as you can see, the idea was to split the colonies in half, to split the New England colonies from their southern counterparts. Because the British Parliament, including Lord George Germain, believed that the cabal, the rebels, were mostly located in the north. And it's actually true to some extent. The southern colonies, at this point, weren't really affected by all the impunities set down by Parliament since 1763. And you would have heard, all the Townsend duties, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Declaratory Act. So all these laws set down by Parliament from 1763 right through to 1775. They weren't as effective as the colonies in the north. So the idea was, if we can separate the north from the south. We can then isolate the north, destroy that rebel group by the likes of John Adams, John Hancock, Samuel Adams. These are the traitors that we need to capture and hang. That was the plan. And when you look at it from a strategic and an operational point of view, it was a very good plan. It could have worked. Could have. So once the British left Boston, John Adams and George Washington, at this stage, John Adams was appointed the chair of the Board of Ordnance and War. So he was like the Secretary of War, or Secretary of Defence. So he's the political leader at this time, and obviously Washington was the Commander-in-Chief. Both of them realised that New York would be the next target. It made sense. New York being where it was located, it was the second largest city in the colonies. It was it had a significant harbour, and I'll go through that in a moment. So Washington sent his second in command, General Charles Lee. General Charles Lee, ex-British officer, knew how the British thought, well, he thought he knew how the British thought. He had a good insight into British structure, British command, British control. He never actually liked Washington. He didn't really approve that Washington was nominated and elected Commander-in-Chief. But at the same time, he was quite loyal. He believed that the only way to survive this war was not to win the war, but not to lose the war. That's the only way to get through it. So the only way not to lose was to run. Where do you run? Into the interior. So the idea was to abandon the coast and move the army into the interior and wait for the British to come to them, and to conduct a guerrilla-style warfare. If that didn't work, build fortifications and do what they call the Bunker Hill system. That is, to destroy as many British soldiers as much as possible. We'll get to a point where the British will have to leave because they're losing too many men. So it was one of attrition. Unfortunately, yes, it could have worked, but Washington dismissed the idea. Washington was of the old style. He believed in one decisive action. Remember that Washington served with the British during the French and Indian War. He was at the Battle of Monongahela, where General Braddock was killed. He never actually led an army or any type of unit into action. But at the same time, he wanted to prove himself. So he and Lord George Germain were of a similar ilk. They wanted to prove themselves. So in Washington's mind, running into the interior was ungentlemanly-like. He needed to prove himself on the battlefield. He wanted to fight the British as they fought. That is, a frontal attack. When Charles Lee went down to New York, he was ordered to fortify the peninsula of Manhattan, or then it was called Long Island. Sorry, not Long Island, it was called York Island. Very difficult to do. How do you defend a peninsula of that type when you're surrounded by water? And remember that the British had the largest navy at that time. And they were also very proficient in amphibious landings, as we saw at the Battle of Quebec, when they landed troops. And William Howe was one of those, he was a colonel at the time, so he served under General Wolfe, who served at the time and led units up the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, just outside Quebec. So the British were quite proficient in amphibious landings. General Howe later wrote a manual in regards to, his brother, Lord Richard Howe, read the manual of amphibious landing. So how do you defend something like New York? But they did, and Charles Lee did a significant and quite a important role here in that he built those forts along the coast, including on the island of Long Island at Brooklyn Heights. Okay, New York, second largest city, roughly 20,000 population. Philadelphia was the largest at 40,000. Boston had 16,000. The actual New York was a lot different then than what it is now. It was only occupied the tip of York Island, which we'll call Manhattan. There was about 11 miles between New York City and Harlem Heights. In between, just farms, undulating land, two main roads that ran up and down the peninsula, close to the coast, quite hilly in the middle, and but most of the population were located at the tip of New York. By 1776, the 20,000 population left. There was only about 5,000 left. Most of the ones that did leave understood that if they stayed, they'd most likely be killed. The ones that did stay were loyalists, so they were hoping that the British would take New York and then they'll be liberated, in their words, and the British will take command of New York City. I'll just show you this particular this particular print. This was the felling of the statue of King George III. This was done on the 9th of July when Washington ordered the Declaration of Independence to be read out to his men on the Commons. So many of the soldiers left the Commons, walked down Broadway to Bowling Green, where this particular statue was located. Obviously, emotions were charged. They saw the statue of King George riding his horse, and as you can see, they pulled it down. Now, they were joined by many of the non-loyalist Americans that were around at that time. But what's significant here is that statue was melted. It was sent up to Connecticut at a foundry, and they made 42,000 shots that were later used to kill the British. Okay? If you are ever in New York and you go to the New York Historical Museum, I think it's the New York City Historical Museum, the tail survived. So the tail was on, I don't know whether it's actually exhibited, but it's somewhere in that museum. So that was the only part that was left of that particular statue. This just gives you an idea of the area we're looking at. So you can see that you've got Manhattan, New York City right at the tip. You get a sense of the scale. You can also see Long Island. Now, obviously Long Island is long and is relatively large compared to Manhattan, but we're going to be focusing on Brooklyn here, the Heights, overlooking the city. Okay, so if you know anything about artillery, you always want to be on the high ground, looking down on your enemy. You can understand why the British wanted to take Brooklyn Heights, because you as an artillerist have good angles into the city itself. Okay, you can see here you've got Staten Island, Narrows. It's about a little bit just over a mile in between Staten Island and Long Island, Grays and Bay. So it gives you an idea of what the area in where the battle actually took place. There will be some further maps as we go. Okay, so the American Army, once Washington made his way to New York around April 1776, he brought the rest of his army down. He had approximately 20,000. Now, no one can actually say how many men Washington had. The main reason being was desertion was quite pandemic. When you're dealing with militia, they were coming and going, no one kept count. It was quite a bit of a rabble. So we can only estimate that he had close to 20,000 men, a combination of continental soldiers and militia. On average, the American soldier had roughly, if that, possibly between 1 or 2 years experience. Not much. And most of that was happened in Boston. The officers, senior officers probably had more experiences. So the likes of Washington, Gates, Horatio Gates, Charles Lee, who served in the French and Indian War. The junior officers had very little, and if anything, they had some militia experience. His two main commanders were not with him during this battle. So General Lee was sent south to take control of the southern command, and Horatio Gates was sent north for the northern department. Remembering that in late 1775, the Americans sent an army up to Albany with the intention of taking Fort Ticonderoga across to Lake Champlain to take Quebec. The main reason being is the British passed the Quebec Act, which allowed the Catholicism to be recognised, and many of the clergy in the Americans, who were most of them from Protestant churches, despised the fact that the British did that and they wanted to take revenge. So they tried to take Quebec, but Sir Guy Carleton defeated the Americans and they fell back. This is where Benedict Arnold first got injured. Although they lost, his reputation blossomed after that particular campaign. Richard Montgomery was killed, so he was the commander then, so he was replaced by Horatio Gates. So moving, as we get closer to this New York campaign, Washington did not have two of his most senior commanders with him. However, he did have General Nathaniel Greene, who was to become the most prominent commander in the American forces throughout the year. Now, Greene was a Quaker, a pacifist, was kicked out of Quakerism because he wanted to fight. So, but a very intelligent man, had very little or no military experience, read about it, but had an innate understanding of tactics and more so how to read the land. So he had this real understanding of how to win a battle. So he proved to be quite an important advisor to General George Washington. Okay, the American Army was a bit of a ad hoc type of army. You had people wearing different uniforms, there were different weapons. We had the backwoodsmen who had the rifle. Not too many of those at this stage. They came into force in the Southern Campaign after 1778. But at this early stage, there were a number of backwoodsmen, but not many. Most of them had, if they had a weapon, they had the Brown Bess, 42-inch rifle, which they weren't disciplined in musketry. They may have fired one shot per minute, as opposed to the British, who could fire up to 3 to 4 shots in a minute. Muscle load. They had no breech loading rifles. The British did, not many, but they had a few. most of the soldiers did not have bayonets. This is very important. They were quite deficient in the bayonets, or even the use of the bayonet in battle. They weren't disciplined soldiers, but they were fighting for a cause. So they had their emotionally driven, if you like. What's interesting, you see horses there. Unfortunately for Washington, he had one squadron of cavalry, the Connecticut Light Cavalry. They turned up, quite experienced cavalrymen. However, when Washington ordered them to assist with fortifications, which meant they had to get off their horses, they refused. It was demeaning. Washington asked again, they again refused. They asked to be relieved, and Washington said goodbye. So, unfortunately for Washington, he lost his only cavalry unit, which would have been quite helpful in the battle. So, Washington went into this army with a quite a very inexperienced army, no cavalry, a few cannon, but most of those cannons were located pointing out into the East River or the Hudson. So you can understand his apprehension as the British started to make their way to Long Island. Okay, another element to this campaign was this dual role that both General William Howe and his brother, Lord Richard Howe, had.
Okay, I found this on the web.
They obviously were commander. William Howe was commander-in-chief of the army. Vice Admiral Richard Howe, Lord Richard Howe, was commander of the naval forces. They were brothers. That was great because they worked well together. So from that point of view, it was really good. Great cooperation. But there was a problem, and that was they were both there to defeat the army, but had a dual role, and that is to negotiate peace. That negotiation was quite limited. Germain didn't want the brothers to be peace commissioners. He actually had the foresight of not having both of them wear the two hats. He fought against it. However, King George believed that that was feasible and that was right to do, and so he overrided Germain's decision. So when they both came to America, they both had two objectives. One is to defeat the American army, but at the same time, they didn't want to cause too much damage, if you like, to property and person, because they wanted to rebuild those relationships with their English fellowmen. So you can understand, possibly if you want to keep that in your head, how that was a determining factor in this particular battle. So that's just a quick sketch there of the musketry that we're dealing with. For those who are not familiar with the workings of a musket, there's the flint and so forth. It's very easy, but at the same time, it might look easy, but for an undisciplined soldier, it was quite awkward to maintain. Now, the British Army, after their strenuous voyage from London, the men came off quite sick. As you can imagine, it was over nearly 2 months at sea, and not the best conditions. Lucky for them, that when they got to New York, they were treated as heroes, as liberators. And the loyalists that were on Staten Island, as they were on Long Island, treated them really well. have ample food, clean accommodation, rest and recreation being the optimal word. Unfortunately, there were many lashes that were ordered due to their relations with the local ladies. But all in all, they were quite ordered and disciplined. So fortunately, they were quite prepared physically and mentally for what was to come. As you can see, the senior officers had a lot more experience. Howe, for example, was only about 43 in 1776. He at least had close to over 20 years experience in the army. Although many of the officers bought their commission, you could only buy your commission up to colonelcy. You couldn't buy beyond that. From what I read, William Howe actually earned his stripes, so to speak. Quite an experienced and innovative commander, as were his subordinates. So second in charge was General Sir Henry Clinton. Again, not the most pleasant guy, didn't have a lot of friends, but a sound tactician. Very good commander on the ground. And then you have, as you know, General Earl Cornwallis, Charles Cornwallis, again, worked his way up. Yes, he did buy his commission, but worked his way up, and again, quite an experienced commanders. So the army that was sent to America was not this rabble. That's a misconception. They all volunteered. The impressment that we know about, that we hear, really only happened very late in the war when they needed more men. Howe had 32,000 soldiers in America. That's more than the population of New York. And he had elite units with him, significant units. And as you can see from the two quotes on the slide, he had the foresight of knowing what kind of war he would be fighting in the Americas. I'll just read that first one. The infantry of the army, without exception, is ordered upon all occasions to form 2 deep with files of 18 inches interval. Now, that's very significant. In the European battle, the British would line up 3 deep, shoulder to shoulder, and would remain in that formation throughout the battle. In North America, Howe had the foresight of ordering a change to that formation. He realised that the line had to be flexible. Why? Because it wasn't the same European battlefields that most commanders were familiar with. There were a lot more obstacles, trees, fences, creeks, hills. So in order to allow for his army to be successful, he had to have a line that was flexible and was able to manoeuvre around these obstacles. So this is not an army that was not prepared for the war in America. It was an army that was prepared. The second quote there is from General Clinton. No superiority of numbers can withstand Britons when they attack in earnest with the bayonet. Now, yes, the bayonet was used in Europe. But what they realised with the American forces, because of their ill-disciplined nature, one shot followed by a charge with the bayonet was quite efficient and effective. So again, we see the commanders on the ground changing their tactics to suit the environment in which they are fighting. A third change around command and control. This particular author, Matthew H. Spring, if you haven't read this book, it's a great book. It goes into a lot of detail with zeal and with bayonet only. Quotes, because it is often unnecessary or even impractical to maintain well-connected line or battle duty advance, field officers were compelled to exercise a far higher degree of tactical initiative. Here we see an example of, again, how and his commanders allow greater autonomy for junior officers to take control of the battlefield. And when I mean junior officers, company commanders, platoon leaders, taking the initiative. So again, I say to you, the British Army that was sent in 1776, not only were they the largest expeditionary force by the British nation at that time, with over 400 ships and 32,000 men, but they had commanders that were willing to change doctrine in order to win this campaign. So you had a combination of large army, elite units, well-disciplined, and generalship that suited this particular battle that they were going into. So did the British Army the British Army at this particular time had the best chance of winning this war? That's what I'm saying to you. They had the best chance of winning this war. And they could have defeated not only the American army, but possibly changed the course of the rebellion. Light infantry. The one thing you noticed when I went to America, the light infantry was around for some time. It started as an idea in 1754, just at the start of the 7 Years' War, so just before the start of the 7 Years' War. By 1770s, the light infantry became its own. The British Army, for the first time, sent to America 4 battalions of light infantry companies. Normally, they are included as part of a heavy battalion. So they're used as skirmishers. Right? For the first time, we have a British Army with 4 separate, dedicated light infantry battalions. Why? Because light infantry allow for flexibility. And how new this? As you can see, they're trained specifically to be flexible on the battlefield. What's important, you can probably just see here, are woods. They were trained not to fire just in volley, but they were trained to fight as pairs. So if we get in a situation where they are working within a wooded area, they would break line, pair up, and fire as separate as pairs. So one fire, one load, one fire, and so forth. Behind trees. This is very interesting. They were actually trained to fire behind cover. So again, we are talking about an army. Not only was it the largest army that was sent, the largest. And remember, in 1768, the entire British army was only 50,000 men across the whole empire. 32,000 was sent just to North America. By the end of the war, the British army went up to 120,000 men across the empire. That's whole recruitment, which that's another story, I won't go into that. But we're talking about a significant investment that was made by Parliament. And who drove Parliament? Lord George Germain. He signed off. Even though he was in charge of the Navy, the Lord Edwards, he looked after that. All provisions was another department. He still was a driver behind it. So you had the largest expeditionary army, you had the best generals, thinking generals, and you had different tactics. Why did the British finish them off? That's the question. Now, the last point there, in order to support the British Army, King George III, as you know, German, the Elector of Hanover, first went to Russia, asked for some support. Catherine the Great decided, no, I'm not going to support you. Okay, no problem. Went to a number of principalities around Germany and did get support. By the end of the war, there were approximately 48,000 Hessians, a big title, but there was a lot of different principalities. We're up to approximately, just found a piece of paper, but we had about 8 different principalities that were supported. The main ones were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the Hesse Castle had, by the end of throughout the war, contributed 22 regiments, and the Brunswick contributed 7 regiments over the course of the war. At Long Island, there were 10,000 Hessians, so they labelled Hessian, but there were different groups within that title. As I said, General Henry Knox was living in New York. Remember that the Americans now were occupying New York. There's Henry Knox having breakfast with his wife. He looked out the window and he saw a major fleet coming in through the Narrows into New York Harbour. By August 15th, there are over 400 ships in this fleet. 400 foot ships, and they were carrying over 32,000 soldiers. And they settled onto Staten Island, in particular the capital there, which is Richmond, in the centre of the island. Within that fleet, approximately 70-odd ships of war. The British had bigger ships, they had 80 guns, but the British Navy decided, due to the Narrows, and they wouldn't send the larger ships of war. The largest were Eagle and Asia, HMS Eagle, which was the flagship, and HMS Asia. Both had 64 guns. Then you had the smaller frigates, which ranged between 42 to 20 guns. We had about 73 men of war, and the rest were transport ships. Now, on July the 12th, remembering that Howe hit Staten Island on July 2nd, July 12th, Lord Richard Howe turned up with part of the fleet. The same day, Lord Richard Howe, Vice Admiral, decided to just test the American fortifications. So he sent 2 ships up the Hudson, the 48-gun HMS Phoenix and a 20-gun HMS Rose. As you can see in that sketch, they sailed up the Hudson, firing off their guns, just testing. One, they were testing the British resolve, but also doing another thing. Just go back to what I said before about how they're wearing 2 hats. They wanted to see if these ships went up and down Hudson firing their guns, whether the Americans would decide, well, that's a lot of firepower, maybe we need to negotiate peace. So it's showing force as well. So he's doing 2 things. The Americans didn't hit the ship, both ships. I fired a lot of cannons. One particular cannon blew up, it killed 20 men. We know Alexander Hamilton, so he was a colonel. He was close by, he nearly died, but he survived, and we know what happened to him. So he was there at the time, because he was part of the artillery. So those 2 ships went up to Hudson, came back down, show of force. We're here. This is the British. We are here, ready for us. Okay? So you can see there on the 12th of August, Clinton and Cornwallis, they did a bit of an expedition down to Charleston. It didn't work. So So they were ordered back up to New York, and as I said before, Clinton became second in command. So by the 15th of August, Howe had 32,000, 20,000 British, 10,000 Hessians. So again, we're wearing two hats. Howe thought, I've sent the ships up, we're showing force here, we're here. The New York harbour was just full of masts, 400 ships are sitting there. So, being a peace commissioner, he decided to try his luck. There were 3 occasions when he tried to negotiate peace. The first occasion, the Americans would never bar of it. Why? Because the British would not recognise General George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. How can you have a Continental Army if you don't have a government? So the theory was, they're not a legitimate government, they're rebels. So we're not going to recognise you as a Commander-in-Chief of an army that didn't exist. Obviously the Americans were offended and said, nope, we're not hearing it. I tried again. On the 3rd occasion, as you can see on July 20th, they had a bit of a parley, and George Washington said those words at the end there. You don't have to pardon us, Lord Richard Howe, because we haven't done anything wrong. And that ended that. So, as you can see, there were no negotiations. Okay, it's all happening. So on August 21, 08:30 hours, the troops were taken off Staten Island, across the Narrows, and landed on Long Island. 2 particular points. One was Dempsey Ferry, but the major landing was at Gravesend Bay. Gravesend Bay. You can see there, again, this is quite, I guess, innovative. They had barges and they had planks which were able to be lowered for the British soldiers to disembark. Very similar to those used in Normandy. Okay? Quite interesting. The British were experienced in amphibious landings. They had the equipment. They had the know-how. They were ready for this. So by the end of that day, Howe had approximately 20,000 men. The remainder were on Staten Island. And as you can see there, he had his senior commanders with him. Cornwallis was an advanced guard, and he made his way to Flatbush. You'll see a map in a moment. There were a few American soldiers there. They fired a couple of shots, they missed, and then they ran. They killed as many animals along the way and burned haystacks. So, but at the same time, there were many Americans who were loyalists that again were liberated, and they supported the British, in particular, being guides and also providing food and shelter. Now, American positions, Washington unfortunately didn't have the spy network that he had in Boston. Why? Because of too many loyalists, and really didn't have that network. And he was blindsided by what was happening. He didn't really know where the British would attack. He thought after the July 12th escapade up the Hudson, he thought the British would land somewhere on either side of Manhattan, either on the Hudson side or East River side. General Greene was quite intuitive and said, I think it's going to be Long Island. He was right. But Washington was still unsure. But at the same time, he still sent men over to Long Island. Right, this just gives you a quick look at the positions on Long Island. So Washington sent over 9,000 men. Charles Lee created 5 major forts along Brooklyn Heights, as they're named there. Again, which is really curious. Remember, Washington, before he became Commander-in-Chief, was a surveyor. Why didn't he know about the Jamaican Pass? Just interesting. And then you had Green, who had some idea of Long Island. So obviously the tactical error was that they positioned themselves to defend significant passes, but unfortunately, as you can see up here, they did not defend the Jamaican Pass, which is way on the right flank of the American forces. Another misfortune. Remember that I said that Lee went south, Gates went north, Greene was Washington's only saviour. Unfortunately for Washington, Lee came down with typhus. So the American camps were quite filthy. They had no sanitation, ill-disciplined troops as opposed to the British. So disease was rampant in the American camps. And unfortunately for Washington, his main general came down. He nearly died actually, he was very close to death. So, John Sullivan served most of the war in the north. After the failure of Quebec, he was sent south to New York. Sullivan was an interesting character. He liked to hear his own voice. He was quite pompous, he loved popularity. His men did whatever they wanted. Again, it was more like a mob rather than an army. Didn't take long for Washington to realise that he picked the wrong guy to defend such an important position. He replaced Sullivan with Israel Putnam. Putnam had some experience, was a better general, but was not the same general as Greene. And again, Putnam had different views as to how to defend Brooklyn Heights. Greene's original thought was to keep all his men on the forts. Putnam decided to move his men forward on the heights of Gowanus, which I'll show you in a moment. So these are American positions. As you can see, they had 3 main armies defending the Gowanus Heights. The heights are located here. Okay, so you had on the American right, you had General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, even though the House of Lords didn't recognise his title, but he became known as Lord Stirling, Scottish peer. So he had about 1,000 men on the American right. In the centre, you had Sullivan with 16. Sullivan's on the. So Stirling was there. Sullivan was in the middle. He had about 1,600 troops, and then Colonel Sam Wiles was in the American left. No one was defending out here. So they thought that they would defend the main passes, but again, no one thought about the Jamaican Pass all the way out to the left. Once the British landed on Long Island, here comes Henry Clinton. Remember, Henry Clinton wasn't liked by his peers, but was a great tactician. The other advantage with Henry Clinton, his father in early 1740s was the governor of New York. Henry Clinton lived in New York. Not only that, they lived on the island of Long Island. He knew Long Island really well. He had an idea that there was another way around. He had to have that confirmed, and he did. He went for a bit of a ride one particular afternoon with 2 officers. They came across a couple of loyalists. He asked a few questions. He captured one and he said, "Show me where this pass is." And they went for a bit of a recon, came back, he developed a plan. He didn't put it to Howe. Howe didn't particularly like Clinton, because Clinton was quite persistent and he thought he knew best. So there was a bit of tension between the two. In the end, it was put to Howe. Howe developed a plan, and that was the plan that the British Army executed on the 27th of August. So this is the plan, very similar to the other maps. At this stage, the British were at Gray's End and New Utrecht. They had two camps. The plan was that, as you can see, while British soldiers were facing the Americans across the line on the heights of Gowanus, Howe would lead 10,000 soldiers, silent march along the King's Highway, starting at 9 o'clock p.m. on the 26th, get to Jamaica Pass early in the morning of the next day. With Howe was Clinton and Cornwallis, and the 17th Dragoons, so he had cavalry with them. Now they did an exquisite job of pitch black, silent march. Pretty hard to be silent when you've got horses, but it worked. So throughout the whole march, Howe was quite scared, well not scared, but concerned that he might be hit. Americans had no idea. They were total ignorance of what was happening. And that's the salt march. So that picture's of Sir Hugh Piercy. And in one of the memoirs, in his memoirs, he makes a number of quotes about how this particular march was executed to perfection, as he called it. Now, once that march went around to Jamaica Hill, a particular tavern, the Rising Sun Tavern, they did come across 5 Americans on horse, and they were sent there as a bit of a second thought. Just go back that way and see whether there's anything out there. They were captured, okay, before they could raise the alarm. Again, more second. So, as you can see the silent march there, Colonel Sam Miles is on the left of the American line. Did hear something on his left, his far left, as the British came around. The plan was that they would come around Jamaica Pass just behind Bedford Village, and the British would sit in long grass, and they would wait until morning. While that was happening, there was a few skirmishes on the main front, on the Gowanus, but the British were ordered not to advance, just to engage, but not to advance, until a signal. And the signal was 2 shots of cannon. Once that 2 shots of cannon erupted, and that was a signal for Howe and his 10,000 men to come to the rear of the British, and for General James Grant and General Heister, the Haitians, to advance at the front of and take the front of the American line, which was positioned along the heights of Gowanus. Okay, this will happen on the morning of the 27th. So that's the British advance. You can see the top photo there is of General James Grant. And the lower photo is of Lieutenant General Leopold van Heister, who was the commander of the Hessian troops. That's the 10,000, or not the whole 10,000, but it's most of it. Now, what's interesting here with the Hessians, quite a disciplined, professional army. They didn't have to fire a shot. The moment they heard the cannon shot, they were ordered to advance. They didn't run, but they moved very quickly up the hill towards the Americans. The Americans already were a bit spooked by the Hessians anyway because of their reputation. A lot of them just dropped their weapons and ran back to Brooklyn Heights. The ones that were caught, there were no mercy shown. So they were bayoneted. And you can see there a quote from a British officer. A British officer was quite shocked by what he saw. The Hessians were quite ruthless in the use of the bayonet. Sullivan was captured, but then was exchanged later on. And at the same time that was happening, you've had 10,000 British at the rear, moving their way past Bedford village towards the shore, in front of Brooklyn Heights. So there's a photo there. That's not the photo of, that's particular photo of White Plains, which is a battle that happened on Manhattan, off Manhattan. And that's a photo, I couldn't find a photo, it's a photo of Bunker Hill. But you get the sense of what's happening here. They're moving their way up the hill. Drums and so forth. Alright, so this is a bit of a closer shot of what was going on. This is all happening on the morning of the 27th of August. You can see here, fighting that's happening between Grant and Lord Stirling. Sullivan was in the middle. You can see that there's a movement here of the Hessians, and then you had the House 10,000 moving around the back. What was happening? So it was beautifully executed. Beautifully executed. There was no fault whatsoever in the preparation and in the execution of the plan. The Americans were quite shocked, surprised, and were not able to systematically oppose the British forces. However, there was a last-ditch fight. It became known as the Battle of the 400 Immortals. Washington did have two quite experienced and elite, he called them elite, you can argue whether they were elite or not, but they were very disciplined soldiers from the 1st Maryland Regiment and the 2nd Delaware Regiment. They happened to be part of Stirling's force here on the Gowanus Road, right on that side. Now, during that action, these two regiments did a marvellous job, considering they were about 4-to-1 ratio. So as you can see there, in particular, just focus on the 1st Maryland Regiment, about 400 men. Stirling did his utmost, and Stirling was quite was mentioned in dispatches as well for his leadership at the time. But he realised the game was up. So what he did, in order to protect and save as many men as possible, he ordered a retreat over a creek that was at high tide. Remember, many of these soldiers didn't have a swim. They didn't have swimming lessons when they were 11. So they had to cross a creek and make their way to Brooklyn Heights in the fortifications. And but he needed someone to hold back the British. So he ordered the Maryland the regiment to stay behind and to hold off. In American history, it was quite, is now known as, they are known as the Immortal 400. There is a book written by Daniel O'Connor, titled The Immortal 400, highly recommend. They did an enormous job under the circumstances. The particular house, the Vecht stone house, where the British occupied, they charged that house 4 times. They had 56% casualty, but they did a great job in holding back the British on that flank. So they're quite regarded within American history, military history. So we come to the end of the battle. It's now midday. So remember, this battle started at 9 o'clock, only half a day, the battle's over. You had complete chaos with what was left of American forces moving up the other hill. So they went from Gowanus Heights down into the valley, up to Brooklyn, running to save their lives back into the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. It was a complete disaster from the American point of view, but a great victory for the British. Now, the question is, why did Howe stop the momentum? So at this point, Howe ordered all British soldiers to stand fast. Right? You remember, there's Clinton, Cornwallis, and other senior commanders seeing the American army flee in panic and in total chaos. Howe halted. Why? That's the question. Here are 3 possible answers or responses. Howe was quite traumatised by Bunker Hill. He was there. He actually led the 3rd wave. He saw his men decimated by the British. So the theory is, did he internalise that and was he traumatised? He didn't want another Bunker Hill. Second, remembering he had 2 hats. His aim was to force the Americans to capitulate and negotiate peace by showing force, but not to decimate the American army or their reputation, because they are our fellow Englishmen. Third, he was having an affair with a loyalist commander, Elizabeth Loring. Some of his own men made up a little bit of a song about what they all do. And so every soldier knew. Some scholars suggest that he was more focused on that than he was about the battlefield, and wanted to get back to Elizabeth as soon as she was. She remained in Staten Island, so he wanted to get back to her. Who knows? But thirdly, there's a big question about the use of the Navy. There was only one naval ship off the coast, HMS Rosebud, that fired a couple of shots while this was happening. Not too sure when you had over 70 ships of war at hand and only one was ordered off the coast, firing into where the Maryland regiment was fighting. They're the casualties at the end. The American forces were quite decimated, as you can see. In particular, the prisoners of war. Prisoners of war at that time were put on hulks. We all know about the hulks, don't we? If you've done ancient Australian history. So the British had hulks in the New York harbour, and they were put on there. Most of them did not survive. Some officers were exchanged, but enlisted men were put on hulks. We all know that the American forces did escape. Again, the miracle, as they call the British Americans call it, the miracle of the evacuation of Brooklyn Heights. The Americans were saved by unfavourable winds and a fog, which disguised their evacuation of Brooklyn Heights over to Manhattan. So I'm very fortunate that those 2 particular events happened. This is Lieutenant Colonel James, who's a senior officer in the American Army at the time, and what his comments on the evacuation and the aftermath. I won't go too much into this, but just gives you an idea that once Washington made it over to Manhattan, which some, I would argue, shouldn't have happened in the first place, because the British had enough momentum to defeat the Americans at Brooklyn Heights. But again, on three different occasions, Howe had the opportunity to destroy the American army. One at Kibbs Bay, another at the Battle of Harlem Heights on the 16th of September, then again at White Plains in October, and finally in November when he captured Fort Washington and Fort Lee in New Jersey. Missed opportunities for those reasons that I just mentioned. Okay, and here are a couple of books that I suggest if you're interested. This one here, Stephen Conway was on that series, Birds. So he was that's a great book. That's the particular book that I Matthew Spring. If you're interested in the British perspective of the war, highly recommend that. It goes into a lot of detail. That's the Washington's Immortals by O'Donnell. Rick Atkinson was also on the series. Andrew Shaughnessy, really good book about, again, those particular prominent British politicians and commanders. If you want to get their perspective, and then they will cover. There's other books, but they're probably some of the ones that I enjoyed reading. Okay, thank you very much. I know I went over time. I really appreciate your time. Any quick questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought of the Ken Burns series, American Revolution.
Yeah, if you take away a lot of the politics of it, and he did a great job from the military standpoint. So his version of what happened on Long Island, although very brief, was to the point.
Well, what I was saying last year, armies never learn from the mistakes of other armies, they have to learn themselves.
Yeah.
And if you look at what happened there, and then you bring it forward to the Union Army, the British and French armies, and the First World War, and so forth, they always seem to make the same mistakes. Not going in hell for leather,
But what's
focusing on tactical rather than
but what I'll say to you is that the British Army, generally speaking, were quite prepared to do that.
Yes, they
Howe's senior commanders and all these junior commanders protested vehemently when the order was given. Clinton, who normally was a little bit wary of Howe, went to his tent and made it clear that he was protesting, but did it unofficially. You know what I mean? So the British Army knew what to do. I say that Howe was not prepared to carry through. So I'm putting the blame on Howe.
Robert, just quickly, how did Washington pay, feed and clothe his army? Where did the funds come from?
Right. So that's a very good question. There was very limited funds. Most of the funds were coming from the colonies themselves, so the assemblies would provision their own soldiers. They would clothe their own soldiers. So from Connecticut, the Connecticut Assembly would provision their militia. Once it became continental, it was up to Congress. Now Congress had no means of paying for it, which is one of the reasons why, right up to Valley Forge, the Continental Army were fleeing, the men were fleeing. You've got to remember, when Washington came to New York, he had approximately 20,000. By the time he hit New Jersey at Valley Forge, he had 2,000 men. He lost all these men along the way, not due to injury to battle, but through desertion. They left because they weren't fed, they weren't provisioned, clothing, and so forth. It was only after Valley Forge, they rebuilt the army. It took them about 6 months to do that, and that was a turning point. The other turning point was Saratoga. I gave this talk a few years ago, the Battle of Saratoga. That was a significant turning point for the Americans. It was a significant victory, and Benedict Arnold, the reason why he became a traitor because he didn't believe he was recognised for winning that battle. That traumatised him big time. Why he wanted to give up West Point when he became commander. And then he fought with the British. You know that Brendan Arnold did fight for the British? He was commissioned as a brigadier general and was in the Southern campaign fighting for the British against his own countrymen. So it had no money. It was only really after, we're talking about after the Valley Forge, things started to change.
You mentioned the Hessians and the Highlanders slaughtered the prisoners of war.
Correct.
What Highlanders are involved and how come?
Well, I think from the Hessian point of view, it was a personal thing. They didn't like the Americans. From the Highlanders, from what we could tell, quite loyal, quite disciplined. They didn't like the Americans because of their rebellious nature. They particularly didn't like the fact that the statue of King George was destroyed and desecrated. There's actually records of Highlanders saying that, I'm paraphrasing, once they met the enemy, they will give no mercy. So there's you've got to remember, these guys were coming in emotionally charged, as were the Americans. The Americans were highly charged, but so were the British. So they got word that statue was destroyed, and in their view, it was desecration. Right? Because they were fighting for country and king. Any other questions? One more?
How did the British Navy not know that this massive evacuation was going on under their nose?
Good question. What saved Washington? Well, actually, Washington was quite brilliant here. He presented the view that he was transferring men over from Manhattan to Long Island to reinforce the forts. So it's a bit of a ruse. In fact, what he was doing was evacuate. Secondly, for him, again, this is a freak of nature, the East River was quite tidal. It's very hard to navigate with a big ship. Like you can do it in a little rowboat, but when you're using sails as a form of protection, it's very hard to navigate. At that particular night and that morning, the tide was against the British, so they were trying to sail upstream in a very strong tide, which was a tidal waters. And then on top of that, early that morning, there was a very thick fog that blanketed, and there's no way the British were going up that river in fog. So Washington was quite fortunate that he had those two weather events occurring at roughly the same time. Yep.
Yeah, I had an ancestor who was there roughly around the period, and it was exchanged in 1777.
Oh, Mac.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, Mac.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, any of these sources talk a lot about the business of war and exchanges?
Yeah, they do in their own way. Mostly, they do touch on it.
Right.
As I said, there was a lot of, for example, Sterling and Sullivan were both captured. Sterling was exchanged later on, so he came back and fought the British later. Sullivan was stupidly thought he could make a difference, and Howe used him as a way of negotiating with the British. So he was discredited, and he was cashiered out of the American Army, and he lived in recluse. But yes, there were a lot of British officers and American officers that were exchanged during this time. Yeah. They don't go into a lot of detail, but I do good. All right, I think we're going to run out of time, so we're going to quickly do I'm going to wear another hat now, wearing the President's hat. So, Francis, we'll just quickly do the raffle. Red ball, so if you need your ticket, please make your way to the table. Pick whatever book you like. First one's a black